The idea sounds almost absurd. In the 21st century, can a US president simply take another country's territory? And yet, here we are. Donald Trump has openly said Greenland is vital to American security. The White House has confirmed that all options are on the table, even force. This is not about ice. It is about power, about how far a superpower believes it can go when it feels strategically boxed in. Greenland is enormous, sparsely populated, militarily exposed, and already home to US forces. On paper, it looks vulnerable, but on a deeper level, it represents something far more dangerous. A stress test for NATO, international law, and the post-World War II order itself. If one NATO ally can threaten another, what does the alliance really stand for? Before you decide this is just political theater, stay with me, because what's unfolding around Greenland tells us where global power may be heading next. And to understand that, we need to step back and see the real problem Trump is trying to solve. So what exactly is the problem here? At its core, this is not a territorial dispute. It is a strategic dilemma. The United States already has military access to Greenland. It already operates a key base there. It already enjoys cooperation with Denmark, a treaty ally. And yet, President Trump has framed Greenland as insufficiently secure. He has argued without presenting evidence that Russian and Chinese activity threatens American interests in the Arctic. From his perspective, access is not enough. Influence is not enough. Control is the real objective. That distinction matters because once a great power decides that formal sovereignty is the only guarantee of security, the rules change, allies become obstacles, law becomes negotiable, and institutions like NATO stop being shields and start becoming constraints. This is why Greenland is not a side issue. It is a window into how power behaves when it feels impatient with process and limits. To understand why this idea even feels plausible, we have to look at how Greenland ended up so exposed in the first place. To see how Greenland became the center of this storm, we need to rewind. Greenland is not a country in the traditional sense. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, with its own parliament, its own government, and control over most domestic affairs. But defense and foreign policy remain Danish responsibilities. This arrangement made sense for decades. The Arctic was distant, frozen, strategically quiet. That world no longer exists. As climate change melts ice and opens new shipping routes, the Arctic has re-entered global politics. Russia has expanded its military footprint across the region. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in polar research and infrastructure. Greenland, vast in size and rich in untapped mineral resources, suddenly looks less like a remote island and more like a geopolitical hinge. And yet, it remains lightly defended, no standing army, limited Danish air and naval coverage, a population of just 58,000 people spread across a territory larger than Western Europe. That imbalanced strategic value without matching protection is what makes Greenland feel vulnerable. And vulnerability, in the logic of great powers, invites ambition. This is where theory ends and crisis begins. Then comes the first real flashpoint. On paper, a military operation to take Greenland would be shockingly straightforward. That is what makes it so unsettling. Greenland has no army. Denmark's forces in the region are limited. Much of the island is patrolled not by soldiers, but by the Sirius Patrol, a small Danish special operations unit that still relies on dog sleds to cover enormous distances. Defense analysts have been blunt. A rapid, overwhelming operation could seize key locations before any meaningful resistance formed. The United States already maintains a permanent military presence at the Pituffik base in the island's northwest, originally established during World War II, when American troops arrived after Nazi Germany occupied Denmark. According to security experts, elite Arctic units based in Alaska, supported by naval and air power, could move quickly. In purely tactical terms, the balance of force is not even close. But this is where the calculation collapses, because such an operation would not just be an invasion of Greenland, it would be an attack by one NATO member on another, and that single act would send shockwaves through the alliance. Here is where the story turns darker and more revealing. Because the real question is not, can the United States take Greenland? It is, what would that actually mean? A military move would shatter a foundational assumption of the modern world, that alliances constrain power rather than enable it. NATO is built on trust, on the idea that members resolve disputes through law and coordination, not force. If Washington were to ignore that principle, the alliance would not bend, it would crack. Former US officials have been clear. Such an action would violate international law. Denmark is not an enemy. Greenland poses no threat. There is no legal justification that survives scrutiny. And domestically, the president's power is not unlimited. Lawmakers could invoke the War Powers Act to block military action without congressional approval. The political cost would be enormous. The diplomatic cost, incalculable. This is the hidden mechanism at work. Military power that is technically overwhelming, but strategically unusable. Force, in this case, would win the island and lose the system. And when force becomes too expensive, power looks for another path. So the conversation shifts from invasion to acquisition. Buying Greenland sounds cleaner, legal, transactional, almost reasonable, at least on the surface. This idea is not new. In 1946, President Harry Truman explored paying Denmark the equivalent of $100 million in gold for the island. Donald Trump has revived that logic, arguing that money is cheaper than conflict. But this path quickly runs into reality. Greenland is not Denmark's to sell outright. Any transfer would require approval from the US Congress, a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and consent from the European Union. And, crucially, it would almost certainly need the participation of Greenlanders themselves in the name of self-determination. That is a legal maze, not a shortcut. There is also the political problem. Trump campaigned on America first, not America, buys an ice-capped island for billions. Spending vast sums of taxpayer money on distant territory could alienate his own base. And if a purchase fails, expectations matter. When leaders publicly frame something as essential to national security, backing down becomes harder. This is the second crisis point, when legal paths close and impatience grows, which leaves one remaining option slower, quieter, and far more subtle. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because whatever strategy Washington considers, it is not abstract for the people who actually live there. It is about you if you were one of the 58,000 Greenlanders whose future is being debated in distant capitals. Most Greenlanders want more autonomy. Many want full independence from Denmark, but polls show something just as clear. They do not want to become Americans. And yet, influence does not require consent at first. It begins with incentives. Short-term money, promises of jobs, infrastructure, opportunity, a quiet campaign to reshape what feels inevitable. US intelligence agencies, according to reports, have already increased their attention on Greenland's independence movement, mapping who might support closer alignment with Washington. From the outside, this looks like geopolitics. From the inside, it feels like pressure. If you are a Greenlander, the horizon you think in is not 4 years. It is centuries, culture, land, identity. This is the emotional fault line of the entire crisis. Because power can persuade governments, but it struggles with people. If this analysis helps you see what's really at stake, stay with me. Because what happens in Greenland will not stay in Greenland. And here is where Greenland stops being just a local story and becomes a global one. Because the ripple effects extend far beyond icy fjords. If the United States tried to assert ownership, it would shake NATO to its core. It would force Europe to reconsider defense commitments, It would send China and Russia recalculating their Arctic strategies. Even subtle moves, financial incentives, influence campaigns, alter regional dynamics. Other Arctic nations watch closely. Energy markets, shipping routes, and mineral extraction plans are suddenly caught in a new web of uncertainty. Greenland is small in population, but enormous in geopolitical weight. Control or influence there means leverage over the Arctic and the North Atlantic, a strategic corridor connecting superpowers. This is why every decision, from Washington to Nuuk, carries consequences not just for the next election, but for the architecture of global power. And as these pressures mount, leaders must choose, act boldly, act carefully, or risk being overtaken by events. The stage is set for three very different futures. Now, let's imagine the three paths ahead, the futures that Greenland and the world could face. Best case, Greenland declares independence peacefully, with strong partnerships with the US and Europe. America gains influence without force, Greenland thrives economically, and NATO remains intact. The Arctic becomes a zone of cooperation rather than conflict. Middle case, negotiations falter. The US increases pressure through incentives, covert campaigns, and military posturing. Tensions rise with Denmark and NATO, but no outright invasion occurs. The world faces uncertainty, alliances are tested, and Greenland becomes a flashpoint of strategic rivalry. Worst case, miscalculation leads to a military operation. Even if bloodshed is minimal, the political and diplomatic fallout is enormous. NATO fractures, Europe questions US reliability, and the Arctic enters a period of instability. Global norms are undermined, and every nation watching learns a dangerous lesson. Power can override law. Each scenario reflects a system's deeper logic. In geopolitics, ambition, impatience, and strategic value collide. Greenland is more than an island. It is a mirror showing how the rules of the world can bend under the weight of a single nation's choices. And finally, the insight we must carry forward. Greenland is not just ice, nor simply a dot on the map. It is a crucible where strategy, law, and human ambition collide. It reminds us that even the strongest alliances are fragile when tested by power and impatience. For the United States, for Denmark, for Greenlanders themselves, the choices made today will echo for decades. Every action has a consequence: military, legal, economic, and human. Even influence campaigns leave traces that endure long after headlines fade. For you watching, this is more than geopolitics. It is a lesson about how power operates, how laws can be strained, and how ordinary people find themselves at the center of global chessboards. The question lingers: will the world uphold rules and cooperation, or will it bend to raw ambition? And as we close this chapter, ask yourself, what does this mean for the next contested space, the next strategic hinge of power? If you want to understand the unfolding story of Arctic geopolitics and its impact on global security, subscribe and follow closely, because the Greenland crisis is far from over.